No one, no one gets to define my humanity for me. Zohran Mamdani's voice cut through the silence like a lightning bolt, standing defiantly at the edge of a narrow wooden stage inside Columbia University's packed Hamilton Hall. The audience froze. Phones trembled in midair. Riley Gaines, standing just 10 feet away, stared at him in disbelief, her expression caught between fury and shock. How did it get here? How did a simple campus panel turn into a national scandal, a media firestorm, and a moral crossroads? Why did Riley Gaines, a former swimmer turned conservative speaker, call out Mamdani for destroying women's sports? Why did she accuse him, an elected official, an immigrant, and a Muslim New Yorker, of being part of what she called a biological lie? And more importantly, why did Zohran Mamdani refuse to walk off that stage? It all began with a forum titled Truth and Fairness in Athletics, an event hosted by the university's Politics and Ethics Club. The idea was straightforward: gather voices from across the spectrum to debate inclusion, fairness, and biology in sports. But from the moment Riley Gaines walked in wearing a USA flag pin and a fixed smile, and Zohran Mamdani entered quietly with a folder under his arm, everyone in the room knew this was not going to be a polite exchange. The moderator barely got through the opening question when Gaines went off script. "With all due respect," she said, "what you're advocating for is not inclusion. It's erasure. You're erasing women like me from competition, from records, from spaces where we've fought to exist." Polite murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mamdani didn't interrupt. He just waited. Gaines continued, "You say trans women are women, but when they step into a race next to me, they're not running against a woman. They're running against a man. You may have political power, Assemblyman, but you don't have the power to change reality." That's when Mamdani finally leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't mock her. He simply said, "What you call reality is a comfort you inherited. What I advocate for is justice, and justice never comes without discomfort." Gasps, a few cheers, but Gaines wouldn't let up. "You say discomfort. I say delusion," she snapped. "Your version of justice puts men in women's locker rooms. Your politics aren't brave. They're cowardly. You're too scared to tell the truth." And then, like thunder cracking the air, Mamdani stood. "No one gets to define my humanity for me. Not a swimmer, not a senator, and certainly not someone who refuses to recognize the existence of people she shares a nation with." That line would be quoted across news networks, tweeted by celebrities, and printed in op-eds for weeks. But in that moment, it wasn't about headlines. It was about a man who refused to be erased. The room erupted, half applause, half protest. Security moved toward the stage. A student shouted, "Shame on you!" at Gaines. Another yelled, "Sit down, Zohran!" But he didn't. Gaines tried to speak again, but the moderator, sweating, shaking, stepped in. Let's take a breath. Assemblyman Mamdani, would you like to clarify your position?" He took a moment. Then he looked at Gaines and said, "My position is simple. Trans lives are not a threat to women. Hatred disguised as science is. And I won't apologize for saying that out loud." At that point, it wasn't a debate anymore. It was a stand. Reporters outside began texting their editors. Student protesters flooded the hallway, some chanting Riley's name, others Zohran's. Meanwhile, inside the room, the moderator looked like he wanted to vanish into the floor. And yet, neither Zohran Mamdani nor Riley Gaines walked away. Because this wasn't just about sports anymore. It was about identity. It was about what it means to share a country and a future with people you might never understand. What happened in that room would echo for days. Headlines would scream, "Clash on campus," and "Zohran versus Riley, who's telling the truth?" Twitter would spin itself into a storm of opinions and outrage. But for now, In this charged silence that followed Mamdani's words, no one knew what would happen next. What happens when the truth is inconvenient? What happens when one person's identity feels like a threat to another's? And what happens when the only way forward is through fire? Stick around. And if this already has you thinking, let me know in the comments. I read them all. And if you want more real talk like this, subscribing makes sure you don't miss a thing. The next morning, Hamilton Hall was surrounded by press vans, student organizers, and two unmarked NYPD cruisers parked just far enough to seem casual. But no one was fooled. What had happened inside that lecture hall wasn't just a moment. It had become a symbol. And symbols don't die quietly. Zohran Mamdani walked back onto campus wearing the same gray blazer from the night before. He hadn't slept much. His phone was a brick of missed calls and media requests, but he ignored them all. He wasn't there to defend a soundbite. He was there because the university had called an emergency follow-up panel, this time closed to the public. But Riley Gaines was already there, seated at the same table, arms crossed, flanked by two advisors from a conservative nonprofit that had flown in overnight. She didn't look shaken. She looked ready. A legal advisor approached Zohran. "She's threatening to sue the university," he said quietly, claiming they created a hostile environment. Zohran didn't flinch. "Did she mention that I got 3 death threats overnight?" he asked. The advisor hesitated. "We're trying to de-escalate." He nodded. "So am I." Inside the room, university officials looked exhausted. The president, Dr. Marilyn Cass, sat at the center, eyes bloodshot. "We're not here to relitigate last night," she began. "We're here because students are afraid. The campus is fractured, and our reputations are on the line." Gaines jumped in immediately. "What about my safety? What about the women here who feel violated by policies that force them to share spaces with biological men?" Zohran didn't look at her. "No one is forcing anything," he said calmly. "But if your definition of safety means erasing someone else's existence, then it's not safety, it's supremacy." Gaines turned to him sharply. "Supremacy? I spoke up for fairness, not supremacy. You spoke up for a version of fairness that excludes, that always ends in supremacy." A long silence followed. One of the student reps, a nervous sophomore named Lena, raised her hand. "I just don't understand why this exploded. It was supposed to be a discussion." Zohran leaned forward. "Because there's no neutral ground when someone's existence is debated. You can't both sides someone's right to be." Dr. Cass held up her hand. "Enough philosophy. Let's talk action. What are you proposing, Assemblyman Mamdani?" He took a deep breath. "I want the university to establish a formal policy protecting trans students from discriminatory speech in school-sponsored events." Gaines scoffed. "So now words are violence?" "Some words are," he said, "especially when they come wrapped in science and used to erase." Her voice raised. "Then tell me, Zohran, do you think I'm a bigot?" He looked at her, finally meeting her eyes. "I think you're terrified of a world you can't control. And when people are afraid, they look for scapegoats. And that, Riley, is the most dangerous kind of cowardice." The room shifted. Even Dr. Cass blinked at the weight of the words. The meeting was adjourned without resolution. But something had shifted. Outside, a group of students waited. Some held signs. "Protect trans lives. Truth is not a weapon." One held a poster with Mamdani's quote from the night before, written in black ink. "No one gets to define my humanity for me." Later that evening, Zohran sat alone on a bench near the campus library, watching the city swallow the last of the sunset. A woman approached him, mid-40s, quiet presence, cautious eyes. "Assemblyman Mamdani?" He stood instinctively. "Yes?" She smiled, almost sadly. "My son is trans. He saw your speech online. He cried. He said it's the first time someone in power said what he's been trying to say his whole life. Zohran didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. You didn't just speak for him, she continued. You made him feel real. And with that, she walked away. Back in his apartment later, Zohran scrolled through the chaos. Tucker Carlson had already featured the debate on his show. There was a photo of Mamdani mid-speech, mouth open, hand raised, a screenshot now turned into a meme by both the left and the right. But below it all, buried in the threads of noise and outrage, were the real messages, the quiet DMs, the thank yous from trans students across the country, the photos of parents hugging their kids, the drawings, the letters. One said simply, I want to be brave like you. Sometimes a scandal isn't a failure. Sometimes it's a mirror. And when you finally see your reflection, unfiltered and raw, the only question left is, do you look away? Or do you stare into it and finally speak? If you're still here, I want to know what you think. Comment below. Seriously. Speak your truth. And if this matters to you, subscribing is how we keep stories like this alive. By Friday, everything had exploded. Cable news anchors debated Zohran Mamdani's name like it was an ideology. Who does this assemblyman think he is? One host spat. Lecturing a female athlete on biology? Hashtags like #Mamdani, meltdown, and #ProtectWomenInSports were trending. Right-wing commentators called for his resignation. Death threats escalated from anonymous DMs to voicemails on his district office line. But Zohran didn't retreat. Instead, he returned to Colombia. Again. This time, not to debate, not to explain, but to listen. A group of LGBTQ+ students had organized a teach-in inside a quiet seminar room tucked behind the law library. They didn't want press. They didn't want speeches. They wanted space. And Zohran, despite the cameras outside waiting for another viral moment, chose that room over the spotlight. He sat in a circle of 15 students, all of them raw with anxiety and defiance. One spoke through tears, describing being misgendered in class. Another talked about being too afraid to go home for winter break. No one recorded anything. No one shouted. When it was his turn to speak, Zohran kept it simple. I'm not here to be your hero. I'm just here to say you deserve more than survival. But outside that calm, a storm brewed. Riley Gaines had scheduled a press conference in front of the main gates. Microphones lined up. A Fox News van idled nearby. She stood at the podium, confident, a printed stack of tweets in one hand. I was invited here in good faith, she said, and I was ambushed by a radical activist who wants to destroy women's sports. I will not be silenced by fringe ideologues. I will not apologize for telling the truth. She accused Mamdani of inciting harassment, of weaponizing identity politics, of using a public university to promote an agenda that erases women. When reporters asked her if she stood by calling trans women biological males, she didn't blink. I stand by science, she said, and I will not be bullied into pretending otherwise. The next day, she filed a formal complaint against Zohran with the New York State Assembly Ethics Committee, alleging defamation and intimidation. That night, Mamdani received an email from the committee asking for a written response. He stared at the screen for a long time. Then he opened a blank document. His first line, there comes a point when silence becomes betrayal, not just of others, but of yourself. He didn't defend himself. He defended the students, the ones who came up to him with shaking voices, the ones who messaged him saying, "You made me feel like I wasn't alone." He submitted his response and turned off his phone. But the attacks didn't stop. Protesters showed up outside his district office. Conservative pundits posted photoshopped images of him in woke warrior armor. A state senator called him a disgrace to the assembly. Yet something else happened, too. Donations to LGBTQ+ youth shelters in New York tripled that week, with many notes saying, "In honor of Zohran." A group of parents in Queens organized a thank you rally. They didn't chant. They didn't yell. They simply held signs with their children's names and the words, "You spoke for my kid." Even inside Columbia, where fear still lingered, professors began to speak out. One anthropology lecturer wrote an open letter in the student newspaper titled, "The Courage to Stay." It read, in part, "I have never seen an elected official refuse to walk away from a fight so easy to abandon. In a time when most politicians hide behind strategy, Zohran Mamdani chose something far more radical: presence." Meanwhile, Zohran walked the streets of Astoria quietly, ducking into small shops, nodding to neighbors, sitting on stoops. Some recognized him and offered a thumbs up. Others looked away. But he never stopped walking. At a bakery on Steinway Street, an older man behind the counter asked, "You're the guy from TV, yeah?" Zohran nodded cautiously. The man leaned in. "My granddaughter's in high school. She came out this year. Said she wanted to be like you. Brave. Thank you." And then, without another word, he handed Zohran a coffee, on the house. It was in those moments, small, fleeting, honest, that he found clarity. Not from the headlines, not from the speeches, but from the quiet acknowledgments of people who had been told their entire lives to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay grateful. He knew the backlash wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But he also knew this. Courage is not loud. It is not perfect. It is not without cost. It's just consistent. And sometimes, consistency is the bravest thing a person can offer. If this story is making you feel something, anger, hope, questions, leave a comment. Let's talk about it. And if stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe. That's how we keep the conversation going. The hearing was closed to the public. No cameras, no reporters. Just 12 members of the New York State Assembly Ethics Committee seated around a rectangular table in a quiet room in Albany, folders in front of them, faces unreadable. Zohran Mamdani walked in alone. He wore no tie, just a crisp shirt, a navy suit, and a look that was neither defensive nor afraid. Just calm. He didn't bring a lawyer. He didn't need one. Because what he was about to say, he believed completely. "Assemblyman Mamdani," the chairwoman began, "you're here today in response to allegations made by Ms. Riley Gaines following an event at Columbia University. She claims you verbally defamed her, incited harassment, and violated codes of conduct for elected officials. Do you understand these claims?" "I do," Zohran said. "Do you wish to respond?" He took a breath and stood. "I want to be very clear. I did not attack Ms. Gaines. I did not incite violence. What I did, on that stage, and in every word since, was defend the right of people to exist without being debated like abstractions." He paused. "We can disagree about policy. That's democracy. But what happened at Columbia was not disagreement. It was an attempt to use institutional credibility to strip human beings of dignity, and I won't apologize for opposing that." A few committee members shifted in their seats. He continued, "I was elected not to represent comfort, but people. All people, including the ones this country has made invisible. If that makes me controversial, so be it. If that costs me re-election, so be it. But I will not betray the trust of those who finally felt seen, just because it became inconvenient for others." The room was quiet. The chairwoman nodded once. "Thank you, Assemblyman. That will be all." As he stepped outside, sunlight hit his face. For the first time in days, the air didn't feel so heavy. That afternoon, the committee released its findings. No violation, no misconduct, no censure. Within minutes, #Zohran cleared began trending. But that wasn't the real victory. The real shift came 2 days later, back at Columbia, where the same students who had once looked down when passing reporters now stood in front of Hamilton Hall and hosted their own panel. Beyond the binary, speaking for ourselves. They didn't invite pundits. They didn't invite politicians. They invited each other. And when Zohran arrived, he stood in the back row, silent, proud, invisible by choice. A student named Amir took the stage, thin voice, nervous hands. When I saw Zohran speak, Amir said, it wasn't about agreeing with every word. It was about realizing that maybe, just maybe, someone up there sees me as more than a debate topic, that maybe my life doesn't have to be an apology. Applause rose, soft at first, then strong. Outside, a reporter tried to ask Zohran for a statement. He smiled, shook his head. Not tonight, he said. It's not my stage. But he wasn't done. That week, Zohran introduced a new bill in the Assembly, the Dignity in Public Discourse Act, aimed at protecting LGBTQ+ individuals from targeted harassment at public forums held by state-funded institutions. It didn't restrict speech. It demanded accountability. It demanded presence. It demanded decency. The bill was mocked by right-wing lawmakers. One called it the woke sensitivity law. But in the first 48 hours, over 30,000 constituents signed a petition supporting it. Hundreds of letters poured in from high school GSAs, college students, parents, even teachers. And then, something unexpected happened. Riley Gaines tweeted, "It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't an attack either. We disagree fundamentally, but I don't want Zohran Mamdani hurt. I just want a real debate. Let's both do better." That single tweet didn't undo the harm. It didn't erase what had been said, but it did something rare. It lowered the temperature. Zohran didn't reply. He didn't need to, because this was never about scoring points. It was about something much harder, holding the line when it's easier to walk away. And so, when the semester ended and campus quieted again, Zohran Mamdani stood at the same stage where it all began, long after the lights were turned off, looking out at the empty chairs. He whispered to no one in particular, "We're not done." Because heroes don't always arrive with capes. Sometimes they show up with trembling hands, steady hearts, and an unwillingness to leave. If you made it this far, thank you. I mean that. Drop a comment. What would you have done in Zohran's place? And if you believe stories like this matter, subscribe. It keeps the truth in the light. Are you saying, Ms. Weiss, that the freedom to criticize injustice ends the moment it makes you uncomfortable? The room went silent. Cameras rolled, but even the hum of the lights seemed to hold its breath. Bari Weiss blinked, just once, her practiced confidence cracking for the briefest second. Across from her, Zohran Mamdani leaned forward, not with aggression, but with clarity. Not to provoke, but to expose. What followed wasn't a debate. It was an unmasking. How did we get to this moment? How did a live-streamed conversation between a New York assemblyman and one of the most influential media figures in America spiral into a national reckoning? And what made millions rally behind a name that, just weeks ago, many had never heard? Let's rewind. It all began with a panel. Columbia University had invited Zohran Mamdani and Bari Weiss to a student-moderated forum on free speech and moral responsibility in media. What sounded like a standard academic discussion turned into a cultural earthquake. Weiss, known for her outspoken criticism of what she calls woke orthodoxy, had painted herself as a free speech warrior. Mamdani, on the other hand, was there to talk about accountability, truth, and the media's complicity in shaping narratives that harm marginalized communities. From the start, the tension was palpable. Weiss opened with a speech that drew polite applause, full of intellectual flourishes and carefully chosen anecdotes. But when Mamdani took the mic, he didn't just respond, he reframed the entire conversation. "There's a difference," he said calmly, "between freedom of speech and freedom from consequences." The crowd murmured. The moderators exchanged glances. And Weiss? She tightened her jaw. But Mamdani wasn't finished. He brought receipts, literal ones. Articles Weiss had written, platforms she'd defended, and in particular, her consistent attacks on student activists who spoke out against Israeli policies in Gaza. Mamdani, the son of a Ugandan academic and an Indian filmmaker, wasn't speaking hypothetically. He was speaking from a lived history of displacement, of watching media reduce entire peoples to one-dimensional narratives. "When Palestinian children are killed and you say nothing," Mamdani said, "but when students chant for peace and you call it anti-Semitism, that's not journalism, that's propaganda." The room exploded. Some booed, some cheered, but no one stayed silent. Weiss fired back, accusing Mamdani of conflating criticism of Hamas with criticism of Palestinian people. She claimed she had always stood for human rights. But Mamdani, unflinching, responded, "Then where were you when the human rights were being violated?" It was this back and forth that went viral. Overnight, the clip of Mamdani's quiet but powerful challenge reached 10 million views. But it wasn't just the content, it was the tone. Calm, reasoned, precise. No yelling, no personal attacks. Just a firm moral compass pointed due north. Mainstream outlets scrambled to cover the fallout. The New York Post accused Mamdani of being radical. Fox News labeled him dangerous. But something unexpected happened. Every attempt to smear him only made his voice stronger. Young voters began organizing under hashtags like #IStandWithZohran. University groups re-invited him to speak. Even some media professionals began to question their own silence. And yet, this was only the beginning. Because what came next was more than a debate. It was an investigation. If you're enjoying the story so far, tap subscribe. It helps us keep sharing voices that matter. In the days that followed the debate, what began as a moment turned into a movement. Zohran Mamdani's name was suddenly everywhere, from TikTok reels dissecting his speech to think pieces in left-leaning journals. But while the public cheered, he stayed quiet, deliberate, focused. Why? Because he knew something deeper was at stake. You see, what most people didn't know, yet, was that Mamdani had received a message just hours after the event. An anonymous tip, a name, a document, and one sentence. "You were right about her." The attachment was a leaked internal memo from a major media nonprofit, an organization that claimed to champion journalistic integrity. In it, Bari Weiss's name appeared repeatedly, not as an employee, but as an informal advisor. The memo detailed strategy sessions on how to protect media allies and discredit anti-Zionist influencers under the guise of anti-Semitism. It was dated 2 years prior. Mamdani didn't rush to expose it. He understood the weight. He needed confirmation. And so he did what few politicians would. He paused, and he dug deeper. While he investigated behind the scenes, Bari Weiss went on the offensive. In an op-ed for her platform, The Free Press, she painted herself as a victim of a coordinated smear campaign by radical leftists. She accused Mamdani of weaponizing identity to shield extremism and claimed he had openly sympathized with terrorists. The smear campaign was ugly, but it didn't work. Because for every accusation, Mamdani responded with transparency. He posted his full speech transcript. He did interviews not with partisan outlets, but with young, independent journalists. And he made one thing clear. This isn't about me. It's about power, who has it, and how they use it to shape truth. Then came the bombshell. A former editor at a major national newspaper contacted Mamdani's team. She had resigned quietly months earlier, burned out and disillusioned. She offered hours of internal emails, communications showing how Weiss had influenced coverage decisions, stories buried, phrases changed, entire narratives reframed. One email read, "Don't use occupation in the headline. Bari says it alienates donors." Another, "We need to make this op-ed about safety, not censorship. Frame it as a free speech issue." This wasn't journalism. It was manipulation dressed in moral language. Still, Mamdani hesitated. He knew releasing the emails would ignite a firestorm. His advisors warned him, "You'll be accused of doxing, of revenge, of being un-American." But truth, he believed, was never un-American. And silence was never neutral. So, in a quiet press conference with no corporate sponsors, no grand stage, no teleprompters, Mamdani did what many feared to do. He told the public the truth. He laid out the documents, the emails, the patterns. He didn't name-call. He didn't gloat. He said only this: democracy depends on informed citizens, and citizens deserve more than curated outrage. They deserve facts. They deserve transparency. They deserve media that does not speak power to comfort, but truth to power. The response was seismic. Newsrooms went into panic mode. Weiss, usually composed, released a tearful video denouncing cancel culture and warning of a witch hunt. But this time, the public wasn't buying it. The phrase weaponized victimhood began trending. And yet, Mamdani hadn't even revealed the most damning part. That was still to come. And when it did, it wouldn't just shake the media. It would shake the foundations of political influence in America. Before we move on, if this story has you thinking, take a second to leave a comment. Do you believe mainstream media shapes what we see or hides what we shouldn't? Just when the media frenzy began to settle into confusion, another shockwave landed. A whistleblower came forward. Her name was Mira Youssef, a former research analyst who had worked under one of Bari Weiss's closest allies at a think tank focused on national security and information integrity. She wasn't a household name. She wasn't a partisan. She was, by her own words, someone who believed in the system, until I saw how it worked. And what she brought with her wasn't a rumor or a blurry PDF. It was a blueprint. A literal strategy document titled Narrative Containment Framework, Red Lines in the Age of Digital Uprisings. Dated 2021. Its stated purpose: to identify and neutralize rising public figures whose platforms threaten Israel-aligned narratives in progressive circles. Zohran Mamdani's name was listed. So were others, activists, journalists, even artists. There were pages describing how to create viral media moments to distract from headlines about Gaza, recommendations on how to infiltrate campus groups and shift the tone of debates, and a whole section labeled Preferred Media Figures, listing Bari Weiss as a high-trust amplifier. The bomb dropped. Mira didn't come forward quietly. She appeared next to Mamdani in a joint interview streamed live on multiple independent news platforms. Calmly, she walked the audience through what she'd seen, what she'd reported internally, and how her concerns were buried, until she had no choice but to walk away. The reaction was thunderous. People were stunned, not just by the content, but by the sheer detail. For years, critics had claimed certain voices were disproportionately platformed, while others were silenced. Now there was proof. But what made the moment explosive wasn't just the whistleblower. It was Mamdani's response. He didn't claim victory. He didn't posture. He asked questions. How many other voices have been erased before they ever reached the public? How many stories were never told, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. And then he paused. Why are we okay with truth being filtered through private agendas? That line echoed everywhere. Suddenly, public trust in major media plummeted. Even traditionally liberal networks couldn't ignore the story anymore. Some tried to downplay it as a misguided policy document. Others claimed Weiss wasn't aware of the full extent. But screenshots proved otherwise. There were emails, direct annotations, even calendar invites bearing her name. The dam had broken. Protests erupted, not just on campuses, but in media offices themselves. Junior staff at major newsrooms demanded independent audits of editorial influence. Donors to once trusted institutions began pulling out. For the first time in years, the myth of a neutral, untouchable media establishment was cracking, and Zohran Mamdani was at the center of it. Still, he refused to center himself. Instead, he called for a town hall, a real one. No corporate sponsors, no invites for elites, just open doors in a Queens community center. Hundreds showed up, not just activists, but teachers, grocery workers, parents, people who said they hadn't trusted politicians in years, until now. He stood there, not as a savior, but as a neighbor, and he said, "I'm not here to win a media war. I'm here to win back reality." A short, sincere reminder. If this story is resonating with you, share it. And if you want more voices like this, subscribe. It takes 2 seconds. By now, the truth was undeniable. The media machines had spun, twisted, and stumbled, but they couldn't unsee what had been laid bare. The leaked documents, the testimonies, the whistleblower. None of it could be dismissed as conspiracy or opinion. This was coordinated narrative manipulation, exposed in full daylight. And Bari Weiss? She vanished from public view. Her podcast paused indefinitely. Her writing ceased. She released a single statement through her legal team, calling the allegations mischaracterizations weaponized by political extremists. But no one was listening, not anymore. Instead, all eyes were on the people reclaiming their power. Zohran Mamdani didn't gloat. He didn't tweet a victory lap. He walked into the state assembly with the same quiet stride he always had. But now, people stood when he entered, not out of protocol, out of respect. He proposed a new bill that very week, the Media Accountability and Transparency Act, aimed at publicly disclosing financial and advisory relationships between news outlets and lobbying groups. It was bold. It was controversial. And yet, it passed committee with bipartisan support. But for Mamdani, it wasn't about legislative points. It was about clarity, about making it harder for stories to be bought, for silence to be packaged as objectivity. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Journalists began signing open letters demanding independence from wealthy donors. University programs reviewed their media partnerships. Even some longtime critics of Mamdani began admitting, albeit grudgingly, that he had forced a necessary conversation. And amid it all, Mamdani stayed rooted in his district, visiting schools, listening at mosques and synagogues, sitting in laundromats and bodegas asking what stories weren't being told. In one particularly moving moment, a teenage girl stood up at a local forum in Jackson Heights, clutching a printed copy of his debate transcript. "I've never felt like someone in power could say what I feel in my gut," she said, her voice shaking. "But when you spoke, I finally believed I wasn't crazy. I just wasn't being heard." Mamdani didn't respond with a speech. He just nodded, eyes full, and said, "That's why we're here." The scandal that began as a clash between two voices ended as something else entirely. A reckoning with the gatekeepers of information and a revival of belief in public truth. He had no corporate backers, no media empire, no billionaire donors whispering behind him, just a mic, a chair, and the courage to speak. And in the end, That was enough to shake a system. Zohran Mamdani didn't win because he shouted louder. He won because he listened deeper, because he asked the questions no one dared to, and because when the lights were brightest, he didn't perform. He told the truth. And maybe that's what a hero really looks like. If you believe voices like Zohran's deserve to be heard, subscribe. And let me know in the comments, what truths do you think we've stopped asking about? Thank you for watching.